going on, folks? Welcome to Midweek Study Hall. If it's your first time here, my name is Philip Godfrey. If you're returning, welcome back, Bible Study family. And so, Midweek Study Hall and weekly Bible study are built off of the scriptures in Matthew 6:33. We hear the Messiah speaking, and he tells us to seek ye first the kingdom of the Father and his righteousness, and all things shall be added unto you. So, we gather here to see, seek, and serve the kingdom of the Father. Today, for Study Hall, we'll be continuing a study series that we began in January entitled From Creation to Revelation, where we've been tasked with the assignment from the Father to walk through the entirety of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation this year. And so we are doing just that. Today, we'll be looking at Jeremiah chapters 34 through 43. Jeremiah chapters 34 through 43. If it's your first time here, you can go back and catch some of the previous studies if you're interested in that on my page in a playlist entitled From Creation to Revelation. All of them will live there. All right, let's jump in. So as we begin to look at chapter 34, we first see here the Father giving some comfort to King Zedekiah through the prophet Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is telling the king that the Father is going to give the city of Jerusalem into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And he's going to burn it down. Nebuchadnezzar is going to burn down. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon at this period of time. But what the Father prophesies through Jeremiah to Zedekiah is that he will not die by the sword, but he will die in peace and will be mourned as a king with respect. This is different from how the previous two kings have, especially how the previous kings have departed from this earth at that time. They died without respect because of the things that they had done against the Father. Chapter 34 then goes on to pivot, and it begins to tell us about a prophetic word that Jeremiah, the Father, delivered through Jeremiah to Zedekiah as well. And what happened was Zedekiah had entered into a covenant with the people of Jerusalem who were still there at the time, that they would free all of their slaves. And so at this time period, the Jews, or the people of Judah, they had Hebrew slaves and also other Jew slaves, so servants in their home. And so they came into an agreement that they were going to free all of those servants. But they eventually do that, but then they renege on it, and they bring those same people that they had freed, who they had let go, they bring them back into captivity as servants. And so the Father is upset at this because from what he says, he told their ancestors, after they came out of Egypt, that they were supposed to free the servants every 7 years. We know this as the 7-year release. So they were supposed to be releasing slaves and freeing the slaves every 7 years. But their ancestors didn't listen to the Father. They did not follow that command, and they did not obey that precept. And the people now, the people of Judah, they were close to obeying it, and Zedekiah was right in decreeing what he had decreed. But because they still did not obey, and they followed after the ways of their ancestors, that the Father is not going to give them into the hands of their enemies for transgressing his covenant. And how did they transgress his covenant? Well, they transgressed his covenant by not keeping the covenant that they entered into. And so when we enter into covenants, or according to the text, when they entered into covenants, it was the Father's expectation that they keep their covenant. And if they broke that covenant, it was considered them transgressing the Father's covenant and the Father's commandment, because he tells them to keep his covenant, to keep their covenants. And so because of this, he tells them that they will see the Babylonian army come back up against them, Jerusalem, and then burn the city down, which we've seen prophesied a number of times before in the previous Jeremiah studies. This brings us to a contrast in chapter 35, where the Father here is comparing the obedience of the Rechabites to the disobedience of the Jews, or the Judeans in the nation of Judah at the time. And so as the chapter begins, we see Jeremiah in the days of Jehoiakim. So we're going back. We were in Zedekiah in chapter 34, but now we're going back to Jehoiakim, the time when he was a king, which was prior to Zedekiah. And so Jeremiah is going to the Rechabites, and he's telling them to come into the house of the Father, and then he provides them with wine to drink. But they refuse. They say that their ancestor Jonadab told them that they were never to drink wine nor build homes, but they should dwell in tents. And they obeyed. All of them obeyed that command that he had given them. And so after this interaction, the father then sends Jeremiah to Judah and Jerusalem, and he rebukes them for their disobedience in not keeping his commands. And he tells them how the Rechabites have followed the commands of their ancestor and their father, but his people have continued to refuse to obey his commandments. And because of this, he decrees at that time, during the time of Jehoiakim, that all of the evil that he had decreed upon them as a people will come to be. It will happen. And he decrees that the Rechabites will always have descendants that serve him. All right, that they will always be a people that serve him. Moving into chapter 36, we see Jeremiah receiving instruction from the Father during the reign of Jehoiakim as well to write a book, and in that book write all the words that the Father has spoken to him regarding Israel and Judah and all the other nations since the days of Josiah. This is King Josiah. So the Father wants Jeremiah to put down in a book, probably where we got the book of Jeremiah from. He wants him to write all of that down in a book, all the prophetic words that he's given him in regards to Israel, in regards to Judah, in regards to all the nations that he's prophesied about. He wants him to write that in a book. And then he wants him to go into the house of the Father in Jerusalem, and he wants him to read that book in front of all of Judah. Well, Jeremiah tasked Baruch to actually document the book, and this is why many believe, like historians believe, that the book of Jeremiah was actually written out by Baruch. And so Jeremiah tasked Baruch with actually penning the words as he spoke them, and then he tells him to go and read them in the house of the Father because Jeremiah was imprisoned at the time and could not go. And so after Baruch finishes reading, he goes and does just that, and he finishes reading in the house of the Father. The princes who were some leaders of the nation, some of them had heard him speak. And so once they had heard him speak, they go and tell the other princes everything that had been said. And then all the princes now this time call Baruch to them to have a private reading, essentially, of the book that he has put together of Jeremiah. And once he's finished doing that, the leaders take this scroll from him. They take the book from him. I'm using book and scroll interchangeably, but they take the book from him, and then they tell him to go hide and to take Jeremiah with them. Both of them go hide and don't tell anyone where they are. The princes then go and read this scroll to the king, Jehoiakim, who gets upset and burns the scroll. He burns up the book that Jeremiah had put together at the obedience of the Father. And he sends people to go and get Jeremiah to bring him before him. But the Father had hidden Jeremiah. We saw that through what I just said. And so then the Father speaks to Jeremiah after the king had burned the scroll, and he tells him to tell Jehoiakim, the guy who just burned up his work, to tell Jehoiakim that the king of Babylon will now certainly come up against him and destroy the land, and that King Jehoiakim will personally not have a descendant sit on the throne as king, because the Father will punish him and his seed for his iniquity. All right. And as the chapter ends, we see Jeremiah and Baruch, they complete another writing of the scroll. They compile another scroll, another book to replace the burned one. All right. And so a lot kind of happened in that chapter. But the thing that really stands out to me is the fact that because of the decisions that Jehoiakim made, now his lineage is being affected. And we see that when Jehoiachin, his son, becomes king, he was not on the throne very long before he was killed. And then Zedekiah becomes king, who was actually Jehoiakim's brother or uncle or something like that, I believe. So hopefully all of that is kind of making sense. As moving to chapter 37, it tells us about an interaction that Jeremiah had with Zedekiah. So we're going back to the time of Zedekiah as king. And so Zedekiah has sent a delegation to Jeremiah to ask him to pray for them regarding the situation with Babylon. The Babylonian army has come up against the city, and they are asking the Jews, the king Zedekiah at the time is asking for assistance and asking what the Father's hand and heart is about the matter. And so even though Babylon was coming up against them at the time, the Babylonians heard that Pharaoh was coming down to help Judah. And so they left. All right, the Babylonians then leave. And the Father tells Zedekiah through the prophet Jeremiah that even though he thinks Egypt came to help him, that they are going to leave and the Babylonians are going to come back. So when the Babylonian army leaves, Jeremiah, he tries to head out and he tries to go into the land of Benjamin to get away from the people. But some of the leaders there, as he was on the way, some of the leaders there accused him of committing treason and actually working for the Babylonians. And so this is where things began to get a little interesting sometimes when we compare to our theology, because as we have seen, we get the privilege of reading this story from hindsight, right? As we have seen, Jeremiah has only done what the Father has told him to do. He's been obedient, right? He's been obedient. And now, through his obedience, what we see is that he is now trying to escape, or not necessarily escape, but trying to leave, trying to get some time to himself, because, or get away to a place to himself, because he knows what's about to happen. But we have leaders here who are committing him of treason simply because he told the truth, simply because he was obedient to the words of the Father, and he only spoke the words that the Father told him to speak. The leaders, the leaders are so upset with him. They're already upset with him for all the prophetic words, and they think that he's speaking against them and whatnot. They're mad because they're not going to have the power, that he's prophesying they're not going to have the power, and that they're not going to be a nation, and they're not going to, they're not going to be leaders anymore. And so they beat him, and then they put him in prison. And this is even after Zedekiah had told them, like, yeah, go right ahead. Let's just go ahead and put him in prison. So Jeremiah is now been beaten and in prison simply because he spoke what the Father told him to speak. And so for some reason, we believe in these seasons of life that if we're being obedient to the Father, that there won't be any challenges, that there won't be any stretching, that there won't be seasons and potentially even extended seasons of staying in belief and staying in faith and staying in hope when all else doesn't look like it's happening, when everything else looks like it's falling apart. But we see here with Jeremiah that may not always be the case. It may not always be I was obedient and there are roses. There might be, but there may be some times where, hey, I was obedient and it looks like everything is falling apart around me. And I can imagine, I'm not saying this is what the text says, but I can imagine that Jeremiah could have felt a certain way, like, man, you told me to be obedient. I said what you told me to say, and now I'm in prison. He's in prison. And so eventually Zedekiah got him out of the prison, and then gives him a daily ration and allows him to stay in the court of the prison. So he's still a prisoner, but now he has a few more provisions and a little bit more I guess I would say freedom to kind of move around. But the leaders aren't happy with that outcome. And as we see in chapter 38, Zedekiah, they go to Zedekiah and then they say that Jeremiah should be put to death for the prophecies that he's spoken. And the king turns him over again. He turns him over to those leaders, and the leaders throw Jeremiah into a pit without food and water, and they leave him there to die, essentially. And so what happens now is that an Ethiopian eunuch, all right, an Ethiopian eunuch. This is not who we would call a believer in the day in this time period or in this setting. The Ethiopian eunuch is an outsider serving the king of Zedekiah in his home in some type of capacity. This Ethiopian, this foreigner, tells the king that they have done evil by throwing Jeremiah into that pit. And the king agrees and goes and tells him to get Jeremiah out of the pit, but put him back in the court of the prison, and then continue to give him his daily ration and whatnot. And so Zedekiah at that point secretly or privately goes to Jeremiah and has a conversation with him where he promises not to put him to death afterwards. He wants to discuss, and they discuss all that the Father has spoken regarding the Babylon situation and what's to come. And at the end, they agree that they were not going to discuss this conversation with anyone else. And Jeremiah goes back out into the court of the prison, where the text tells us that he stayed until Jerusalem went into captivity. And then we begin to see that captivity in chapter 39 with Babylon and the army coming against Jerusalem in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign as king. And then 2 years later, in the 11th year, we see the city of Jerusalem falling. All right. And at the time, Zedekiah, he tries to, when the city falls, he tries to sneak out. He tries to sneak out the back, basically, and get away from prophecy. I don't know how he's trying to do that. But anyway, the enemy comes, the Babylonians come, and they attack him, and they catch him. They kill his sons while he watches it. They kill all of his leaders, and then they poke his eyes out, and they bind him with chains, and they take him back to Babylon. And the text goes on to tell us that after that, they burned down his house and they burned down the city of Jerusalem. And an interesting point here, number one, this is the fulfillment of many prophecies, as we saw the fathers telling him, like Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar is going to burn this city down for all the people who stay here. And then the interesting point here that is, I want to make sure I share, is that the army captain, left the poor people in the land of Judah. So not every single solitary Judean or Jew left. There were those who were poor in the land who stayed at the instruction of the king and of the army commander to keep the vineyards, to keep fields, and to kind of continue to sow and grow and produce on the land. What's interesting, that the interesting part about that to me is that these poor people who would have been the lowest class of society of there at that time, in a day's notice, in a moment's notice, they were now the only ones. They now had things that they never had before. They now had vineyards that they could till and grow and produce from. They had fields that they could keep. They probably had more than that. You know what I mean? So their situation shifted completely, and I thought that was a really interesting addition. And so during the roundup of all those that are left, Nebuchadnezzar tells the army captain to get Jeremiah, but don't do any harm to him, and then let him go wherever he says he wants to go. And as the chapter ends, we see the father decreeing through Jeremiah here to the Ethiopian eunuch that we just talked about, who saved him, that the father, will deliver him because he put his trust in Yahuwah. He put his trust in the Father. And so this is a precursor to the Father telling us, in the Father showing us that when we put our trust in him, when we believe on him, then deliverance takes place. And we see that through what he promises the Ethiopian eunuch here. And this brings us into chapter 40, where we have Jeremiah being released from the chains. So everyone who was captured by the Babylonian army went into chains, and Jeremiah, the army captain, removes Jeremiah's chains, and he gives him the option. He says, hey, you can go to Babylon with me, you can stay here in Judah, or you can go to Gedaliah, who was left to lead all the people who were left in the land. So Gedaliah was essentially the leader appointed by Nebuchadnezzar to watch over all of those who had been left behind, all the poor people, all those who were left, and the servants and whatnot who were left to kind of tend to the land. He says, hey, you can go and be with him as well. And so Jeremiah decides that he is going to stay, and he's going to go and dwell with Gedaliah. All right. And as the chapter ends, there's a plot. We see that a plot begins to form to kill Gedaliah by some of the rogue Judean leaders, Jewish leaders, because they had had issues with him being chosen, being the one chosen over other people. And so they kind of wanted to continue to have that power and that status of leadership, but they didn't like that Gedaliah was the one who was given that opportunity, I guess. And so this plot to kill him is ultimately carried out in the beginning of chapter 41 by Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah. And so Ishmael goes on like a killing spree. He murders some of the people who were with Gedaliah, who were following him, that he was tasked with leading. And there were some visitors who come and to see Gedaliah, and he murdered them as well and throw them in like this mass grave that was going on. That's a whole thing you can read about in chapter 41. But after that, Jehonan hears what's going on. Jehonan is also one of these like leaders of the nation at the time, and he hears what's going on, and he goes up with some of his fighters to kill Ishmael. But Ishmael gets away, and he goes and hides with the Ammonites, I believe. But he goes and hides with the enemy. And after this, Johanan and those that he had saved from Ishmael and his kind of reign of terror, they left the land of Judea and they went to the edge of Egypt. All right. They went to the edge of Egypt because they were afraid of the Babylonians because of Gedaliah, that Gedaliah had been killed. And that was who they had put in charge. And so that was who the Babylonians had put in charge. So they were afraid to go to Babylon because of what happened. They didn't want to, I guess, get any wrath because of what had happened to their leader that they had appointed. So, and this brings us into chapter 42, where now Johanan and the people, they're asking Jeremiah to inquire of the father regarding what they should do. They're asking if they should go into Egypt, should they not go into Egypt? And then Jeremiah goes to the father with the request, and ultimately the father tells him the same thing that we've been hearing, the same thing that Jeremiah's been saying this whole time. He tells them that, hey, if you go, the father says that if you go into Babylon, the father actually says, tell them that if they go into Babylon, then he will deliver them. But if they go into Egypt, basically they will ultimately die. All right. Uh, this is an interesting point again, because again, Jeremiah is only telling them what the Father has told him. He's only speaking the words of the Father. He is obeying the Father, and the people rebel against him. They get upset, and they accuse Jeremiah of speaking falsely, of lying regarding the matter, and they believe ultimately that Jeremiah is trying to set them up to be killed by the Babylonians. So they disobey the instruction of the Father and go into Egypt. All right. And this, and Jeremiah, we'll see this in a few more chapters, but Jeremiah ends up down in Egypt as well. But as chapter 42 ends, the Father decrees that because of what they had done, he will send Nebuchadnezzar to Egypt to burn down the houses of all the false gods of Egypt and to carry them away captive. So basically, he's telling them, they're like, hey, this is chapter 43. I got my numbers mixed up. But, but he's telling them that, hey, basically, like, it doesn't matter. Even though you're trying to get away from Babylon by going to Egypt, I'm still going to send Babylon down to Egypt to get you and to carry you away to be captives in Egypt. I mean, to be captives of Babylon. And while he's there, I'm just going to get Nebuchadnezzar to burn down all the houses of these false gods of Egypt as well. And so that's all I got for us today, folks. Thank you so much for joining. We'll be continuing with Jeremiah 44 through 52 in the next study hall segment. I'll see you then. I love you, but more important than that, the Father loves you. Let him love you, folks. Start before you're ready and don't stop. I'll see you guys soon.